when we say young men are themselves at 3 times the rate as young women, we use terms like accountability or say things, well, if they just opened up more about their emotions or they need to get their act together. And that is, we've decided when it comes to men, compassion is a zero-sum game. And that if you feel bad for men, it immediately kind of outs you as someone who might be anti-women or who's gone red pill. Because the void, the statistics are just staggering. 4 times more likely to be addicted, 12 times more likely to be incarcerated. And because nobody was talking openly and honestly about those very real issues, that void created opportunity for what I think are some unproductive voices to fill that void and start speaking to these men. And naturally, a lot of people now have a gag reflex when they hear people talking about the problems around men.
And a lot of these men are finding role models online like Andrew Tate, who is many people describe as a symptom of this crisis. Is there anything that Andrew Tate says that you fundamentally agree with?
Mm-hmm.
I understand there's a lot that you have a different opinion on, but what is it that he says that you think holds merit?
I'll go further than that. I think the majority of what Andrew Tate says is probably positive. It starts from a really good place. Take accountability for your actions, be in great shape, be action-oriented. But it then kind of comes off the rails. And one of the ways you kind of take accountability or take action is to start treating women as property, is to sign up for my class on how to trade crypto, which makes Trump University look like Harvard. I mean, it's just, it's a bit of a grift. And I also think that what starts off as positive, and that's quite frankly, that's the most dangerous thing about it, because you can imagine a young boy, a young man, just agreeing with most of it. And so then they adopt the last 10 or 20%, which quite frankly is just really ugly. It's just misogyny. With incarceration, with male abandonment, and with a lack of teachers in primary school, you have an entire generation of young men who grow up having never had a male role model. If you were to point to a single point of failure where all of this starts, if you said, where did this young man come off the tracks? If you tried to identify one signal through all the noise, it would be the following: when the boy no longer has a male role model. So the first is, we need to frame the problem as, this is a real issue that requires and deserves compassion and our sympathy. You know, it's not a zero-sum game. Civil rights didn't hurt white people. Gay marriage didn't in any way diminish heteronormative marriage. And so the first is to have a conversation that this is a group that's struggling, and to stop using terms like accountability and somehow blaming them for their own problems here. The 19-year-old male should not pay for the sins of his father or grandfather. Now, and my Yoda on this is Richard Reeves, but basically it comes down to kind of 3 things. The first is biological. Our prefrontal cortex does not mature as fast as a woman's. An 18-year-old woman, from an executive function standpoint, is like a 20-year-old male. So, or put another way, 2 seniors in high school applying to college, the woman is essentially competing against a 16-year-old. And that is, her prefrontal cortex had that executive function that he has. She had it at 16. So we're seeing double the number of women graduating from U.S. colleges as men, because it's 60-40 ratio when they start, and then the ratio only gets worse because more men drop out. That still is an incredible on-ramp to influence and economic security, and these men aren't getting on that on-ramp. So there's biological reasons. There's also, I think the education system is just biased against men. A boy is twice as likely on a risk-adjusted basis or a behavior-adjusted basis to be suspended for the exact same activity as a girl who's brought into the principal's office for this exact same infraction. You're sitting in front of me as a guy, you're twice as likely to be suspended for cheating on your chemistry test as a girl coming in. A black boy is 5 times as likely to be suspended as a girl. So they're biologically behind women, have an education system biased against them, and we have economic policies that have created a great deal of shame and rage. And the last point I would just say is, for the first time in Europe and America's history, a 30-year-old is not doing as well as his or her parents were at 30. And that creates just tremendous shame and rage. It's especially hard on men because I think men are still primarily evaluated in terms through the lens of their economic vitality. I mean, look at the housing market. The average age of a first-time home buyer is 47 now. In 1980, the average age of a first-time home buyer was 29. Young people have been sequestered from whatever you call, loosely speaking, the American dream or the UK dream. So the odds are just the forces in the face of young men have just become greater and greater, and it's manifesting in a lot of different ways. Lower marriage rates, lower birth rates, and skyrocketing in suicide. I should also add that suicide is way up among teen girls because of social media. So different challenges at different ages.
What is masculinity? Isn't that, you're writing a book at the moment, right? You're writing 2 books at the moment about various subject matters. Mm-hmm. What can you tell us about what you're writing about?
Yeah, well, I'm finished with the Algebra of Wealth book. I'm just starting the book on masculinity, but I think we need, per our previous comments, I think some unfortunate voices have filled this void around masculinity, and I think we need a new vision for modern masculinity. On the far right, I would argue that those forces have conflated masculinity with cruelty. I think people like Trump and Putin and Elon Musk are looked to as role models for masculinity for a lot of good reasons. But I think being a murderer, Putin, a criminal, Trump, or someone who has 11 kids, none of whom he's living with, Musk, I think that is exactly what it means to not be a man. And when I try and trifurcate the 3 legs of the stool of masculinity, and I'm still working through this, and I'm curious if you have any thoughts, but I come up, and then, so on the far right, let me back up, the wrong vision of masculinity. On the far left, as far as I can tell, their vision of masculinity is to act more like a woman. I don't think that's right either. It's like, well, how do men become better men? Act more like a woman. I mean, I don't think that's not only what men in society are looking for. I don't think that's what women are looking for. I think if there's a fire or Russian soldiers pour over the Ukrainian border, you want some of that big dick energy. And I also think that women are attracted to, generally speaking, this isn't true across the spectrum. We're having a really important conversation and everyone deserves respect. But I think demonstrating a certain level of unabashed masculinity is really important in romantic relationships. And for me, the pillars or the 3 legs of the stool of masculinity, trying to distill it down to 3 things, are first, protector. I think that I was in Seattle at the Westin Hotel and I was checking in, and there was an alarm went off, and they closed the elevators and said, a smoke alarm has gone off on the 11th floor. And these firefighters about 9 minutes later showed up carrying, each of them must have been carrying 80 pounds of equipment and axes and all sorts of shit. And it was 9 men and 1 woman. And they don't look at the cameras to see if there's a raging fire on the 11th floor. They just bomb to the 11th floor. They're just there to protect people. Like, yeah, we might die. Fireman is actually more dangerous than being a cop. It's more dangerous than being in the military. But they're there to protect you. And whether it's the military or things are cops or people or a head of household that's providing economically, I think being a protector is a key component of masculinity. And I also want to say that masculinity is not isolated to people born as males. I think a lot of women demonstrate masculinity. I think it's a wonderful attribute. I personally end up being more drawn to friends who have more feminine characteristics, which are also wonderful. But generally speaking, if we're going to have an adult conversation around gender and gender roles and masculinity, I think we need to acknowledge that 95% of us will have an easier time embracing these types of behaviors more commonly associated with people born as males and born as females. But the modern vision of protection needs some nuance, and that is the trans community. I think most men don't understand, at their heart, don't really understand the trans community, don't understand the notion that parents and a doctor might decide that a 15-year-old should have surgery and go through transition with hormones. I think the majority of men don't, when that hits them, don't understand it. And I think that lack of understanding can lead to unconscious discrimination and bias. And I think part of being a real protector is to acknowledge that you don't need to understand stuff to protect people. And that is, I think our first inclination should be as men, this is a community. Maybe I understand this. Maybe I don't. Maybe I do know trans people. I don't know trans people. Clear out the politics of it. Clear out your misunderstanding. This is a community that is taking a lot of shit, even you could argue being persecuted. Your first role as a man in his masculinity is to move to protect them. Full stop. That's what we do. We protect people, and we err on the side of protection. And I think that's a really nice attribute, to start from a level of protection. When you see someone being hurt, you don't need to understand the situation. If you see someone getting beaten up in a subway, if you see a fight about to break out in a bar, you don't need to understand the situation. You move to protection. Full stop. That's what we do as men. The second is provider. 70% of divorce filings are from women, and it's usually a function of three things. The guy loses his business, has a mental breakdown, or goes bankrupt. Men are still looked to be the economic provider. And that's not to say that, and part of that is to embrace this wonderful progress women have made, and many times acknowledge, that the woman or your partner is just better at this whole money thing and being supportive and getting out of her way. Because your job is just to ensure, play a role, that you can provide for the family. And then getting to a point where you can take care of yourself, take care of your family, and then start to expand the circle and start taking care of extended family, start taking care of the community, donations, philanthropy. I think that's to be a provider for people that ultimately you don't know is a form of masculinity, right? To plant the seeds of trees that you will never sit under, the shade of which you'll never sit under. And then the final one is procreator. And this is the one I'm working through and will definitely get me in the most trouble. But I do think that part of masculinity is being the initiator in a romantic relationship and pursuing romantic relationships. And there's a difference between pursuit and being a predator. And if you don't understand the difference, you've got much bigger problems. And because of some well-publicized and heinous, abhorrent acts where men abuse their power, now we conflate any sort of initiative or aggression around establishing a romantic relationship as predatory. And I don't think that's true. I think men's role in being more aggressive around romantic relationships, and even aggressive is a tough word, being the initiator, I think that is part of masculinity. I think that's part of success. One of the things, I hope my boys, I think I told you this last time I was here, when I used to go down, I don't do it anymore because it just got too much, but I used to force my kids whenever we went out to talk to a stranger. And we'd sit outside our house with my 13-year-old, very upset because he hadn't talked to a stranger. I wasn't going to let him back in the house. I'm like, just go pet the dog, just say hi, anything. But that ability to initiate contact, professionally, personally, whatever it is, I think it's fundamental to success. And so I think guys need to, early on, hopefully get comfortable with approaching strangers. Yeah, including strange potential romantic partners.
Because the stats are showing that about 50% of people who end up in relationships made their first contact online.
Technology is enabling people to say, well, why subject yourself to that risk? You can engage in something that feels sort of similar without any risk at all. And over the long term, it's just such a bad trade. I mean, you were talking about porn. Porn is the largest unsupervised experiment on young men that we've ever had. And it's largely unsupervised because there isn't a lot of academic research on it, because most academics don't want to be known as the porn professor. So there really is a lack of research around it. And when I coach young men, the first thing I do, kind of my go-to, is I get their phone, I look at screen time. I'm like, okay, let's think of what do you have as a young person? You have a lack of financial capital, but you have a lot of human capital. And that's really important, time. So we're going to think about your time as money, and we're going to decide how we're going to invest it. Let's look at your current portfolio of investments. And I ask them to unlock their phone, and I say, I won't be judgmental. In between Twitter, TikTok, porn, Coinbase, it's so easy to find a minimum of 10 and sometimes up to 50 hours a week. And we're going to reallocate it. And we're going to reallocate it to other things. And one of the things we're going to reallocate it to is, like, first, we got to make some money. Are you making any money? You got to make some. I don't care if it's flipping on an Uber app. I don't care if it's becoming an Instacart, a Dasher. The best way to make a lot of money is to start making a little bit, because you start developing the skills and the hunger for more money, right? The second is we're going to take some time and we're going to try and invest in organizations or activities that put us in the company of random strangers, not just potential romantic interests, but friends, mentors. That's super important. And one of the keys to developing what I'll call the mojo to take those risks around romantic relationships is to moderate your consumption of porn. One of the only reasons I graduated from UCLA was because one of my motivations for going to class was not only that I wanted to learn, not only that I needed to learn to graduate, I was a terrible student, but the prospect of potentially meeting a woman who I could take to one of my fraternity parties or that ultimately might be interested in me romantically and sexually. And if I'd had the access to porn that young men have now, I'm not sure that mojo would have been as great to get out of the house as often. So just to tell young men not to engage in porn, I think is sort of ridiculous. But look at it analytically and think, okay, would you be more inclined to get out of the house, take those risks, engage in the victory, engage in what it is to be a man and be a mammal, if you had reallocated some capital and ensured that that fire was still there? So modulating porn and more generally spending less time online. Every digital version of your life is a shittier vision of the analog version that could happen. But everyone said, I'd rather have shitty kind of okay TV that's just mind numbing as opposed to putting in the effort to do something great. But I think it's more than just porn. I think it's all of it. Why leave the house? Why endure that sort of rejection, effort, expense? It's not just so expensive to go out, right? So, but I think porn is one of those things that young men need to modulate and find, and such that they get their mojo. And here's the thing, Stephen, and this is, the bottom line is when we go to solutions, the number one solution for what ails young men is other men. And that is, if we want better men, we have to be better men. And I think the ultimate expression of masculinity, where it shows you're powerful, you're strong, you're smart, is when you get involved and irrationally passionate about the well-being of another child. That shows you have hit a certain level of success. And unfortunately, I was on Bill Maher. I'm doing a lot of name dropping right now. And I said that. And Bill Maher immediately went, well, I'm not going to get involved in any 15-year-old boy's life. They're going to think I'm a pervert. And the reality is the Catholic Church and Michael Jackson have fucked it up for all of us. And that is 99.99% of paternal and fraternal love that men want to display and get involved in a young man's life is positive. And society has taught us to be suspect of those men. And it's a real shame because those random, generous men who came into my life were instrumental in my development and turning into a productive citizen. I think a lot of men have the inclinations and that desire to get involved. And the good news is these young men in need of guidance are everywhere. Sometimes it's just your friends' kids, because biologically, kids start pulling away from their parents because they need to get out, leave the nest. So they start thinking anything your dad says is just wrong and stupid. But your dad's friend, when he says the exact same thing, you kind of nod your head and it makes sense. And young men who need guidance are everywhere. My nanny's kid is struggling. Your friends' kids are struggling. Young boys are struggling. I get emails every day from dozens of young men who are clearly just like good kids trying to figure it out. They're just trying to figure it out. And they want a little bit of reassurance and a little bit of guidance in someone just to tell them that they matter.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.